Okay. Okay, it's 7:01, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to St. George's Talks. Schönen guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und willkommen, herzlich willkommen in St. Georg's Gespräche. This is a series of monthly talks, lectures on the theme of either local interest to this area, Whitechapel, or particular interest to this building, a German Lutheran church, which has not changed since 1762, when it was built by a community of German sugar bakers, immigrant to the City of London. My name is Rick Jones. I'm honoured to serve on the committee that looks after this Grade 2 historic building. The building has wooden box pews, which an audience here live is sitting in now in front of me. Slightly chilly, but they're all wrapped up warm, unlike you at home in your pajamas who are enjoying a glass of wine and watching us here in the church. But we shall be enjoying a glass of wine together at the end of the talk. The fact that this is a historic and ancient building is appropriate this evening because our speaker is an archaeologist, a senior archaeologist and project officer at MOLA, the Museum for London Archaeology, which has its Golden Jubilee this year. Although once part of the Museum of London, MOLA has been separate for several years. It found the Roman amphitheatre beneath the Guildhall, Southend Saxon princely burial plot. MOLA is not only concerned with sites in London, and some 15,000 skeletons beneath the priory at St. Mary's Spital in Spitalfields. Our speaker is a member of the Chartered Institute of Archaeologists, the CIFA, to distinguish it from the CIA, and fellow of the Great Society of Antiquaries, to whom we owe in part the founding of the British Museum. Our speaker is a specialist in excavating Elizabethan and Jacobean theatres and worked on digs which unearthed what remains of the curtain and the theatre in Shoreditch, both of them associated with the Elizabethan period, of Shakespeare. And so there is no one better to give us now the history of the Boar's Head Playhouse here in Whitechapel. So will you welcome, please, our guest this evening from the Museum of London Archaeology, Heather Knight. Heather.
Thank you, Rick, for the introduction. As Rick just said, I'm an archaeologist with MOLA, and I spent most of 2019 excavating a site at the junction of Whitechapel High Street and Middlesex Street. It's not going to work for me now. Is it going to work for me now? No, it's going to be one of these moments. Ooh. No, it's going to be talk amongst yourselves for 5 minutes. It was working beautifully, but now it's not.
Let's try it.
At least I got IT support tonight, you see. So let's see. Yay! We're in business. Brilliant. So yeah, I spent most of 2019 excavating this site at the junction of Whitechapel High Street and Middlesex Street ahead of Unite students building that building, Hayloft Point. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me here this evening to talk about the history and archaeology of this site. For a bit of context, if you're walking from Aldgate Tube Station down to Aldgate East Tube Station, halfway between those two is this site. And anybody who's walked past the site prior to there being a massive big 22-story building on the site and wondered why there was this cavernous hole behind a hoarding, and that's because this was the original site of Aldgate East Tube Station. The tube station closed in 1938, and then they moved it to a new site. And yay, there we go. And so the tube station closed in 1938, and it and subsequent damage caused during the Second World War and the demolition of post-war buildings on the site meant that at the beginning of the 21st century, the site had become, derelict. It was a derelict car park with a hole behind the hoarding. And the author, poet Tom Chivers, eloquently opens his book London Clay by writing about this once derelict site and the curious hole that drew him into wondering about its hidden past. And I'd like to read the opening lines from his book. He said, "There is a hole in the city to whose ruined energy field I am drawn like iron filings to a magnet, like a whirl of hair down the plug hole, here in Aldgate, where East End meets the old Roman city in a knotted mess of roads and empty pedestrian subways. The hole lies in a fenced-off island of waste ground, measuring 150 by 80 feet, wedged between Aldgate Roundabout and Galston Street. Its northern edge abuts United House, a 10-story concrete office block that has been derelict for as long as I've lived here. Its ground floor is open to the elements and employed as a makeshift car park. The crumbling walls and blocked-off doorways have become a canvas for graffiti taggers. It's in this inauspicious, somewhat forgotten corner of Aldgate that my journey across London and into the deep city begins." And he goes on to write, "I can barely see the hole because it's too overgrown, obscured by a dark green canopy. If only I could get inside, I think I could attempt a descent, a quest to unearth whatever secrets lie hidden in the ground." Well, a quest to unearth whatever secrets lie hidden in the ground sounds like a job for an archaeologist, and I had the pleasure of leading a team of archaeologists on that very quest. So because of the hole, we knew before we did any work that previous development had truncated the archaeology to a certain extent. The question was, to what extent? Would there be anything left in the ground for us to find beyond discarded 21st century plastic? So to answer that question, we carried out a series of archaeological evaluations, which meant we dug trial trenches to assess the nature, level, and extent of the archaeology on the site. And the first of these evaluations was actually carried out by Mola over 20 years ago. But we had more intensive evaluations across the site in 2018 and 2019. There we go. We've got too many. There's our evaluations. So, the kind of exciting results from our evaluation work, we found a well-preserved series of 17th century brick structures in the centre of the site. And from historic documents and maps, it appears there's every likelihood the walls were associated with the Boar's Head Inn and Playhouse. Boar's Head Playhouse is one of only a handful of Elizabethan theatres that skirt the outskirts of the city. Because the remains of 16th century theatres are rare, and of national importance, the remains have been preserved in situ, and the foundations for the new building, Hayloft Point, were designed to protect this area. So all the foundations for that massive big building actually span over and around the archaeology in the middle. So with the remains of the Boar's Head carefully covered up, it meant we could focus our work on 3 areas around those preserved remains. Now, the survival of archaeology in what we've called Area 3, closest to Whitechapel High Street, was not surprisingly limited due to the depth and extent of those foundations of the old underground station. But the survival was much better in what we called Areas 1 and Area 2. The earliest archaeological deposits found on the site date to the early 16th century. It's an interesting time in the site's history. By the 16th century, Whitechapel High Street had begun to develop along its frontages, and the 16th century AGAS map there shows a range of buildings on the site, some or all of which made up a property called the Boar's Head Inn. Boar's Head Inn dates to around 1530. John Stowe, bless them, described Middlesex Street, then called Clay, as being a road flanked by fair hedgerows of elm trees, with bridges and easy stiles to pass over into the pleasant fields, very commodious for citizens therein to walk about, and otherwise to recreate and refresh their dull spirits in the sweet and wholesome air. Rather pleasant image of rural Whitechapel. But what Stowe doesn't mention is a lot of these fields were quarried for brick earth and gravel. Brick earth, as the name suggests, was used for brick making. And once the brick earth and gravel had been dug out, the large holes left behind were useful places to dispose of rubbish. And one of these backfilled quarry pits has produced a really interesting find, which I will talk about in a minute. So we can see the site lay a little to the east of the city wall, and from the 12th century, just inside the city wall, was Holy Trinity Priory, which was home to a community of Augustinian friars known as the Black Canons. They own land outside the city wall, including some of the fields mentioned by Stowe on the west side of Middlesex Street. And our curious find is this. It's a papal bulla or lead seal, which would have been attached to official documents issued by the Vatican. And it was issued by this man, who is Pope Gregory XI, who was Pope from around 1370 to 1378. So the papal bulla, little lead seal, it measures about 3.5 centimeters across, and it's about 0.5 centimeter thick. And the front side of the bulla depicts the faces of Peter and St. Paul, and above the image is the abbreviation for St. Peter and St. Paul, SPA, SPE. So St. Paul is the chap with the long beard and the bald head, and St. Peter is one with a rather kind of neat beard and curly hair. And the reverse side of the bulla shows the name of the Pope, and it has a hole through the middle and a cord passed through it, which would attach the seal to a sheet of vellum or parchment. So what is a 14th century seal from a document like this, issued by Pope Gregory XI, doing in a quarry pit backfilled in the early 16th century? Well, it may have been deposited at the time of the dissolution. So Holy Trinity was finally dissolved by Henry VIII in 1532. And it's possible the seal may have been still attached to the parchment or vellum, was disposed of at this time, but due to the poor survival of organics on the site, only the lead seal has survived. And it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition that we have this sacred object on a site that's more famous for very secular activities, the site being the location of the Boar's Head Playhouse. So the first reference to the Boar's Head is in, there we go, that's the Boar's Head, in 1530, when it belonged to John Transfield. The Boar's Head was a place to stay, it was a place to get a drink, it was a place to get something to eat, but it was also a place to take in the show, even before a playhouse was built on the site. Although if we were there on the 5th of September 1557, we wouldn't have been watching a play called A Sack Full of News. The actors run into trouble with the city authorities, and all we know about the play was that it was deemed to be lewd, and the performance was halted, and the actors all got into trouble. But this is one of the earliest references to performance in London. So in 1598, the Boar's Head ceased just being an inn when a playhouse was built. Stage measuring around 12 meters by 7.5 meters was built in the middle of the yard. The playhouse was successful and was improved and upgraded a year later. The stage was moved to the west side of the yard so the actors could walk onto the stage from the tiring house, that's their dressing rooms, and the roof was built over the stage, and the galleries surrounding the yard where the audience were sitting and standing to watch performance were enlarged and improved. Now we know a lot about the Boar's Head thanks to research by theatre historians, including Professor Herbert Berry, who researched its origins and its owners. Herbert Berry's book has some really useful drawings of what the building may have looked like. So this is where all these nice reconstructions are from. They're from Herbert Berry's book. Now, over the past few years, I've had the pleasure of working closely with a team from a project called Before Shakespeare. This was an AHRC funded project that simply asked the questions, how and why did commercial playhouses come to be built in London during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I? So we engaged in performance and archival research with a bit of archaeology thrown into the mix to explore the world of 16th century playhouses and the plays performed in them. Everybody kind of involved in this interdisciplinary project has given me things to think about. And this is Callan Davis, who was the Before Shakespeare Research Fellow. Callan wrote a really interesting blog in December 2018. He said, much ink has been spent exploring some of the major male figures involved with buying land or renting property, building and converting tenements, and pulling together, through a variety of approaches, a playhouse. There are reasons why apparent big hitters in the industry, like James Burbage, John Brain, Philip Henslow, take centre stage, partly because they're main chief movers behind these ambitious and unusual ventures, but also because the above narrative is based on a narrow sense of what a playhouse is and on who might be instrumental to its wider development and existence. Women's involvement in the transaction and legal exchanges that underpin playhouse ownership has been less discussed, though we are becoming increasingly aware of the significance of a host of figures central to this history. Well, I have certainly become very aware of one woman central to the history of the Boar's Head. John Transfield owned the Boar's Head in 1530, and around 1558, he married Jane Grove. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about Jane Grove. And the reason I've chosen this image is we don't actually know what she looks like. So we've got this beautiful artist's impression of what she may have looked like. She's kind of been sort of there in the history of the Boar's Head, but she's never really taken centre stage. John Transfield died in 1561, and Jane inherited his property, the Boar's Head and Gardens. So in 1561, Jane is the sole owner of the Boar's Head. In 1562, she married a lawyer called Edmund Poley. Edmund Poley would then have become the owner of the Boar's Head because on marriage, her property became his. Edmund died in 1587 and Jane reclaimed her property. Jane is once again the owner of the Boar's Head. Jane then turned the garden plots into tenements and rented them out. So in 1593, they were valued at £109 per annum. So Jane was a rich lady. She's an accomplished businesswoman. And it was Jane who leased the inn to Oliver and Susan Woodliffe in November 1594. At this point, John, which is Jane's son, he's about 29. He's the sort of man of the house. But it's interesting that in 1603, Oliver Woodliffe said in court that they had leased the property from Jane Poley, widow, and Henry Poley, son of the said Jane. They didn't say sort of Master Poley or Mr. Poley and his widowed mother. So it seems from reading Oliver Woodliffe's testimony, it's Jane who's the one who's running the business. It's Jane making a success of the Boar's Head, and it's Jane who's the driving force. She makes some smart decisions when she leases the Boar's Head to the Woodliffes. For one thing, she reserves rent-free lodgings on the premises for her and her son. So, can you imagine rent-free lodgings now in this area of Aldgate? She's a smart lady. So Jane died in 1601 and was buried at St Mary Matflawn. I think many historians have overlooked her really, and this written in 1970s is fairly typical of the way she's been seen, as just being seen as an illiterate widow. Edmund Poley's widow, Jane Poley, was illiterate as appears from her will, to which she affixed her mark in 1601. Well, illiterate or not, it was Jane making a success of the Boar's Head Inn, and it was Jane who was instrumental in the Boar's Head becoming a proper playhouse. Jane's story, along with the stories of other women's involvement, is now finally being recognised. And if you walk past the site, you'll say Jane is now looming large once again over the site. So I say we don't know what she looked like, but I think this image has captured the essence of a woman who was determined, resourceful, and successful. So where does the Boar's Head that Jane Poley knew so well fit into the theatrical scene of early 17th century London? Well, here's a map of all the venues in London in the 16th and early 17th century. They're not all operating at the same time, so it's it's a bit misleading in that way, but we can see that along with the indoor playing spaces and the city inns, the Boar's Head is one of a handful of playhouses outside the city. Now, performance continued in inns before, during, and after the Boar's Head Playhouse was there, but there's a subtle but important difference between an inn and a playhouse. Inns were primarily places to stay, to go and get a drink, to get something to eat, and you might take in a show while you were there. As opposed to a playhouse, whose primary function was entertainment, although you could buy a drink while you were there. So the construction of purpose-built playhouses, and there's a whole hour plus more conversation over what we mean by purpose-built, but purpose-built playhouses, of which the Boar's Head is one, changed the reason people went out in the afternoon. And it's that change which separates a playhouse like the Boar's Head from those city inns. So, who were people flocking to see at the Boar's Head? Well, we know Worcester's men, who later became Queen Anna's men. There is Queen Anna, and there are some of her men. We know some of the performer, and we know some of the names of the actors. We've got Will Kemp, and we've got Thomas Green. Thomas Green there in his costume, in his role as Bubble from a play called The City Gallant, which dates around 1611. And Queen Anna of Denmark was a patron of the arts. She also, quite daringly, performed at court in sort of, you know, in sort of Christmas masks and things. So she's quite a girl. So we have this image of her there in her costume. So Queen Anna of Denmark, patron of the arts. Without her backing, these boys would not have lived. They would not have been the superstars of their day. So we obviously know a lot about Queen Anna because she's, you know, married to the king. But it's quite difficult sometimes to actually get to understand ordinary people who are involved with the playhouses. And quite often our only source is court documents. Now, I'm going to read through this one. It's a bit gossipy. I always think it's a bit like a sort of script for EastEnders. So hang in with me. So this one is interesting, as again, it highlights, though or not on stage, women had many roles in the life of the playhouse. So in a lawsuit, Thomas Green, the actor, said that Queen Anna's men had hired Mary Phillips the previous winter to keep the gallery doors at the Boar's Head during performance. So she was making sure no one's sneaking in without paying. So the lawsuit arose because Green was told by Ellis, Mary's husband, that Richard Christopher, or his wife, said that all women doorkeepers are whores. Now, so it's a bit like an EastEnders script as well. So Green, along with Mary, confronted Christopher, who, after denying the charge, called Mary a whore to her face. Green testifies that he believes this constitutes slander. I think so. Good for Mary Phillips for taking matters to court. She wasn't going to allow her good name to be tarnished. She wanted this redressed in public. So Mary Phillips, one of those figures associated with the Boar's Head who existed in the shadows of the performers, and if it wasn't for her moment in court, we wouldn't know that she even existed. We still don't know if she won her case. But if the matter wasn't settled at the time, it has been now, as Mary Phillips has taken centre stage alongside Queen Anna and Jane Holy, three very visible women. They're very visible. They're 3 meters high on the side of a building at one of London's major junctions. So yeah, 3 very visible women standing proud and redressing the balance and widening that sense of who was actually involved in the success of the Boar's Head Playhouse. So we've seen this before, this conjecture of the Boar's Head, what it may have looked like. It had a rectangular stage in a rectangular yard surrounded by rectangular galleries. Not at all what most people think of when they think of Playhouse. And I think the Boar's Head has suffered from it's not round like the globe. And I get the feeling it's not seen by most people as a proper playhouse, it being seen as an addition to an existing structure. But, well, or is it that despite hosting performances of plays by playwrights such as Thomas Hayward, it doesn't have that connection to Shakespeare that's been so central to what most people think of as a London playhouse? It's a shame because it had an interesting repertoire. These are just some of the plays performed there, including plays written by Hayward, Dekker, Rowley, Middleton. A lot of the plays were set in London as opposed to far off lands, and a lot of the characters would have been instantly recognizable by the audience as they reflected the audience themselves. So craftsmen, apprentices, wives of city merchants, travelers, plays about the people that those watching completely understood, plays that made the Boar's Head a financial success. And it seems people couldn't get enough of Hayward's comedies with characters such as Somebody and Nobody. The costume of Nobody is essentially just a big pair of trousers. You know, he has no body. This is a very visual joke here. And the humor revolves around the play on words, as we can see from the inscription written on the text next to this image of John Green. Nobody's virtue is praised everywhere. So the Boar's Head is about 900 meters southeast of another playhouse called the Curtain in Shoreditch. Queen Anne's men played both venues in the early 17th century, although a letter sent to the Lord Mayor from the Privy Council in March 1602 says that of all the places that the Queen's men play, it is the Boar's Head, excuse me, it is the Boar's Head that is the place they have especially used and do best like of. But by understanding more about the Boar's Head, will also help to refine our understanding of how these neighbouring buildings were used, particularly the Curtain and the theatre. Yeah, the Curtain and the theatre in Shoreditch. So I said the Boar's Head isn't necessarily what most people think of when they think 17th century playhouse. And this is partly, you know, so this is a kind of pity, really. If we look at the Boar's Head in relation to the theatrical scene in late 16th, early 17th century London, that rectangular shape doesn't look out of place. So here's a list of all the playhouses in London. And if we simplify polygonal, those 14, 16, 18-sided buildings to round, and if we simplify square and rectangular to rectangular, you can see it's not a simple narrative. It's not rectangular, you know, is superseded by polygonal, for instance, by round. Both seem perfectly valid forms all the way through that period. But it does kind of make sense if we look at them spatially. So if we put our simplified forms back on our map and we take away all those city-inns and indoor playing spaces for a moment, and look at it after the Red Line Theatre had been demolished, this is the theatrical landscape of London in around 1600. And we seem to have a distinct north-south divide. So we have these round playhouses on Bankside and the square rectangular playhouses. Is it that we have different style of performances happening in these buildings? Possibly. If we liken it to cinema, is it a bit more Kill Bill up north with a bit more kind of violent action and comedy, as opposed to a bit more Harry Met Sally, a bit more rom-com going on Bankside? Possibly. Will we ever get to the bottom of it? Probably not. But it is something that's turned theatre history upside down, and it's going to keep theatre historians busy for a long time, trying to understand exactly what's happening at this point in time. But back to the archaeology. Our initial evaluation work in our trial trenches found a well-preserved series of these post-medieval brick structures in the centre of the site. And we found a wall on the east side of the site, which appears to form the front wall of this structure, the Boar's Head lodgings, which is a range of buildings on the east side of the Boar's Head yard, which was converted into the gallery space for the audience to watch performance. Now, further excavation within the footprint of this building was very rewarding in that we found a chalk footing for the back wall, So we know the building's around 4 meters wide. We also have a fragment of internal brick earth floor and this brick structure, which appears to be a cellar, which again fits really well with Herbert Berry's conjecture of what the building would have looked like. It's just very unfortunate that the buildings that were constructed on the site in the 1960s have destroyed any evidence there may have been of the stage and the tiring house, that dressing room. But if you have a wander around, have a look around the site, you'll see the new landscaping incorporating the playhouse, actually incorporates the playhouse outline. So it's actually marked out in the paving around the site. So, and it kind of gives us a sense of the space of the playhouse that was entertaining Londoners and visitors from 1598 until it closed in 1616. But obviously archaeology can go further than just letting us think about the building itself. It's also asking us questions about the people who are using the building, especially asking questions about the audience who would have been standing in front of the stage. Now, the Boar's Head is one of 8 playhouse sites to be excavated in London. Let's find that. There we go. Although, sadly, Newington Bus there, it's just off the map. Nothing remains of that playhouse, although we did try, but you know, can't win them all, I guess. But along with Boar's Head, the Red Lion Theatre, the Curtain in Shoreditch, north of the river, we had previously excavated the Rose, small part of the Globe, and the Hoke on Bankside. And the results from the Boar's Head excavation is adding to a bigger data set. And by looking at the similarities and the differences between these sites, they're telling us much more about each other rather than just one site in isolation. Now, people often think that archaeologists are just interested in finding objects, finding things. Well, we are interested in finding things, but only in as much as we're interested in what they can add to our understanding of the past. When we leave here today and this space is clean, there'll be very little evidence of what's actually taking place now. And the same kind of thing happens with playhouses. These buildings were not occupied by the same people all the time. They were not occupied by the same group of people day in, day out. And they actually, looks like they were cleaned quite regularly as well. But when we compare the things we found from the other playhouse sites, we can start to build up a picture of what appears to be, archaeologically, the depositional signature of a London playhouse, things you would expect to find in a place of commercial entertainment, the things that are common to all playhouses. And we are beginning to understand, we're beginning to understand the external surfaces that are contemporary with the Boar's Head, to the north of the playhouse, the space where people mingled and they met and they had a drink. And finds from these surfaces include, not surprisingly, fragments of beer mug. These are distinct kind of glossy black glazed beer mugs that date from the early 17th century. Another type of objects we find associated with playhouses, which again we're finding on those external surfaces, are these things. They're funny little looking things, and they are the tops from money pots like this. So imagine a money pot, it's like about the size of a grapefruit, and they've got these little sort of distinctive finials on the top. And we find the finials in kind of quite quantity on these sites. Now, the traditional narrative of these things is they were used to collect money at the door by people like Mary Phillips at the Boar's Head, or J. Hughes at the Red Bull. Those employed to collect money were known as gatherers. Now, the sealed ceramic pots, the sealed ceramic pots would have provided some security in collecting the takings, but only if the gatherers were honest, which, if the satirical jibe from the Actors' Remonstrance of 1643 is to be believed, it may not always be the case. It suggests that the gatherers were quite devious in cheating the system. They seem to scratch their heads where they itch not and drop shillings and half-crown pieces in at their collars. So they pretend to scratch their heads and they're really dropping coins down their clothing. So I can't see how this secreting of some of the takings in their clothing would be counteracted by the use of money pots. And the size would also limit the amount of coins you could get into one pot. So are they being used for something else? Well, are they being used by the sort of 16th century version of the cinema usherettes, for instance, selling food and drink during performance rather than taking money at the door? Just one of the many questions that the Boar's Head excavation may be able to help answer. So finds from the Boar's Head include hundreds of fragments of pottery, clay tobacco pipes, oysters, cockle shells, animal bones, which gives us a clue as to what the audience were doing, what they were eating, and what they were drinking in the Playhouse. But one of the big questions that the excavations really begun to answer is what happened when the Playhouse closed in 1616. So the lease expired, the landowner, Jane's son, decided not to renew it, but sold off. He sort of split up the Boar's Head property in smaller tenements, sold them off. We found refuse pits cut through those external surfaces, which were contemporary with the Boar's Head, and finds from the refuse pits date to around 1620. About the same time the Playhouse was demolished. And one of my favourite things from one of these pits is this. It's a bone bodkin made from animal bone. Bodkins like this, they have lots and lots of uses, but they're quite often used to lace your stays or your corsets. For those of us who wear lace, stays and corsets. So there's the wide eye at the end, you can pass a ribbon through, and it just makes lacing easier. A simple yet beautiful personal object that languished in a rubbish pit for 400 years. So, in the mid-17th century, William Gilston, London merchant, active committee member of the Royal African and East India Companies, inherited property in Whitechapel. And it was William Gilston who was responsible for a major redevelopment in the area, including the renaming of Boar's Head Alley as Gilston Street. So when the site was extensively redeveloped in the mid-17th century, the presence of so many pits caused the builders some problems. But 17th century bricklayers, when they were encountering soft, uneven ground, resolved the problem by using these blocks of medieval Reigate stone as foundations to prevent the building subsiding into the soft ground below. Now, Reigate stone is a green sandstone. It used to be quarried at the foot of the North Downs. And these blocks were originally from kind of a high status medieval building, but were recycled by the bricklayers in the 17th century. Now, Reigate stone is no longer quarried, and these Reigate blocks have once again been recycled as Unite students donated them to the Tower of London to be used by their stonemasons to conserve the buildings in their care. So recycling and making use of waste products, we think of as a very modern concept. But tenement buildings that were built on the site seem to have an industrial use. And the main industry was all about recycling a waste material. And we found lots of these, especially in that buildings. If you're wondering what those weird looking things are, I'm going to give you a clue. All these animals have them. Cows, sheep, goats all have horns. And the horns were a waste product from butchery and tanning. So the bits we find are the horny, sort of the bone, the core of the horn, which is the bottom image, as the outer coatings made of keratin, similar to your fingernails, was a really useful material. And it was put to good use by the Worshipful Company of Horners, a city livery company that can trace its origins back to the 13th century. And horn can be made into many things. Its transparency makes it useful for things like panes in lanterns, but it was used for spoons and shoe horns, all sorts of things, all made from horn. A useful, cheap, pliable, translucent material. To transform animal horn into this malleable material takes a lot of skill and a lot of boiling water. And it was described as an ingenious but sinking business. And as such, was banished to the outskirts of the city. I can only imagine the smell, actually, far cry from Stowe's description of the sweet and wholesome air. So 50 years after Stowe was writing his survey of London, Middlesex Street had become the centre of hornworking. And in sort of 1641, 75% of horn workers in London were resident in Middlesex Street. So another rather noxious trade that was coexisting with horn working was clay tobacco pipe making. Tobacco was introduced to England in the 1570s, and by the beginning of the 17th century, smoking had become popular throughout England, with pipe making industry developing to meet this ever-increasing demand. It's mentioned in a poem by Gilpin, written in 1598, the year Boar's Head Playhouse opened. See him yonder, who sits over the stage with his tobacco pipe now at his mouth. It is Cornelius, that brave gallant youth. There are documents that refer to clay pipe makers living and working in Boar's Head Yard in the 17th century. And a court case from 1665 mentions a William Tompkins of Boar's Head Yard. He is witness in a case brought by Anne Touchbury, an apprentice to another pipe maker called Richard Price, also from Boar's Head Yard. Anne claimed Price had tied her to a beam by her wrists and beaten her. Unreasonably beaten her is actually what she said. Well, good for her for bringing him to court, but Anne Touchbury, she's another one of these strong and resilient women associated with the site. So there's Boar's Head Yard. Now, we found evidence of clay tobacco pipe production during the evaluation, including a hearth from a kiln, which dates from around 1680, 1710. We found chunks of the kiln lining. It was constructed from pipe clay and has clay pipes within it. So it's a sort of ceramic version of Watland Daub, if you like. The clay pipes are really useful for dating archaeological deposits as they change shape and size over time. So simply, the really small ones, the really early ones, and they kind of get larger. So by the 17th century, 18th century, they're quite big and chunky. So when we came to the excavation, one of the questions was, could we find any more evidence of clay pipe making? And the short answer was, yes, we did. We found a kiln, and the pipes associated with it date from around 1750. It was built inside one of the buildings shown on that 17th century map. So there's the kiln. On the other side of the wall, to a room which retained its earlier fireplace. So we've got fireplace in one building, kiln in the neighbouring building. So we had a circular hearth. We had no idea what was underneath it. So we took out this later backfill. It was kind of filled in a hole to raise the ground when the kiln went out of use. And we found the front of the kiln, the stoke pit, where the fire would have been, and a cobbled surface, which was a step down into the stoke pit. So we dug out the backfill out of the flue, and we were amazed at this kind of intact and kind of intricate radial flue structure that would have distributed the heat even around the kiln. Again, the flue system had been constructed from pipe clay and pipe stems. I always think this bit looks like badly cooked macaroni cheese, actually. It's sort of, you know, I cook badly. That's what my macaroni cheese always looks like. So it's kind of got that black, sort of brown, glossy, vitreous surface to it. And I think a lot of people assume archaeologists only use trowels and brushes. Well, occasionally they do have their place, especially when they're excavating a kiln. But it's kind of really nice time to be an archaeologist because we've got so many other tools at our disposal. And one of those new exciting tools that we are at our disposal is photogrammetry. So by taking a series of overlapping photographs, which are then digitally stitched together, we can make a 3D model. And the model is available to look at online. It's ready and waiting for you, I think. Let's have a look. Yeah. Sketchfab.com. If you go to Sketchfab and search for Middlesex Street, you can have a look at it, you know, play with it, turn it around, look at it from every angle. Now, the reason the kiln was backfilled and went out of use was again when the site was redeveloped, this time in the late 18th century, when terrace houses fronting Dalston Street were built on the site. And we have the foundations for these buildings and associated cesspits. So Dalston Street was extended in the early 19th century, and the buildings shown on Horwood's 1813 map were then demolished. So in the mid-19th century, warehouses and other commercial buildings, that's better, were built on the site. And we have the foundations for these buildings. Just highlight them in yellow for you. And amongst these foundations was an intriguing, tiny find. Very small button with a clock or a watch, but it's a watch face with a time showing 12 minutes past 7. I think it's kind of an apt object for an archaeologist, as it's archaeology that has shown us how the site over time has been changed, adapted to different uses. I have had the pleasure of working with an amazing team of archaeologists. One of them is in the audience tonight. Thanks, Dave. At least somebody turned up. Thank you. So yeah, I've had the pleasure of working with an amazing team of archaeologists, and it's thanks to them and their hard work we are learning so much more about this small but important corner of Whitechapel, from papal connections to playhouses to pipe making. Hayloft Point has been a wonderful project to work on. It's produced some really brilliant results, and it's given us the chance to reevaluate the role of the Boar's Head Playhouse in London's theatre scene. And it will give us the chance to look again at other existing archaeological archives in the context of new knowledge. So Unite students have not just created Hayloft Point, They have given us the chance to see the people of 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century Whitechapel in a new light, and remind us that they were real people living real lives. And it's only now, thanks to archaeology, that they're being given their chance to tell us their stories. So thank you. I'll find my glass of water. I'm in the dark somewhere.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was a real enlightenment, and you brought alive beautifully a picture of the past, people living here in Whitechapel and entertaining themselves, going to the Boar's Head Theatre. So thank you very much for that. Now, are there any questions either online, Imo, or in the audience here? People would like to ask. Yes. Yes. Shall I just repeat that? The question is it known which period the Earl of Derby's men and the Earl of Worcester's men actually performed here, Heather?
Hello. Yes, so the theatre opens 1598, it closes in 1616. A lot of the actors who start off in Worcester's company, they end up in Queen Anne's company anyway, and so you get quite a lot of folk shifting around. They're not kind of loyal to one particular company for long. So yeah, it is a really, really short time. And a lot of these playhouses are only in existence for quite a short time. That's when I said, you know, we had that map with all those buildings on. It's quite misleading because 20, 21 years seems to be about an average lifespan for one of these buildings. We think of them as these sort of, you know, I don't know, great institutions, but they're really quite fleeting. They're like little fireworks. They just kind of pop up and they're bright for a few years, maybe a couple of decades, and they disappear. So yeah, so it's from 1598 to 1616. He's Shakespeare at that point. He's Kingsman. Yeah, yeah. I don't think he ever crossed the. Yeah, he was Chamberlain's men. Okay, which is Leicester. So you've got Chamberlain's men performing at the theatre. From he joins. I mean, they're there quite early on. Theatre's built in 1576. It's in Shoreditch. He joins them some point in the mid 1590s. The theatre closes. They then move over to the Curtain, which is only 200 meters away. They're at the Curtain from say 1597, 1598, while their new playhouse is being built, which is the Globe, and then they take up residency in the new Globe around 1600. So yeah, he starts off in Shoreditch and then moves over there. He just misses a trick. He never comes over to the Boar's Head. No, he doesn't know what he's missing. It's brilliant, brilliant stage comedy. Sorry? Early-ish, so 1590s. So yeah, so while Shakespeare is at the Curtain and then the Globe, they're over
here. Yes, please.
We're told that the theatres were built outside the city boundaries because of the authorities. But surely the authorities who have been upset were within government rather than the city.
Oh, they managed to upset everybody. I think it's more a case of practicality, actually. If you think about a building that, say, take the Curtain or the theatre or Boar's Head, a building that's 22 meters across, 22, 25 meters across, something like that. It's a big building. You need outside space. There's probably the same kind of footprint again. So something you're getting on for, you need a plot of land sort of 50 meters by about 50. You haven't got that inside the city. The city is absolutely rammed. There is no space inside the city for new big buildings. So they just come just outside. And when we say we're outside the city, if you see Middlesex Street is the divide, isn't it, between, you know, Whitechapel and the city. You cross over and you're in the city. They're right on the edge. If you look at the curtain, it's just on the edge. If you look at the Red Bull, it's just on the edge. If you look at the Fortune up near Barbican, it's just on the edge. So you don't have to go very far, but it is that space.
So it's not to do with avoiding censorship.
No, it's just very practical. I want to build a big building. Where do I do it? Oh, there, because I've got space. So yeah.
Imo?
We have Chris Susnick online who asks, why were these buildings so short-lived? Was it tax, censorship, competition, or lack of investment?
Oh, it's normally leases. It comes down to, quite often, it's certainly the case with the Boar's Head and the Curtain. The lease comes up for renewal, and the landlord thinks, actually, I could get more revenue elsewhere. This is really, ridiculous, and they don't actually get their leases renewed. The longest lived building we think we have is probably the Curtain, and that's the theatre for 50 years. So that's a real grand old lady by the time it finally closes in 1627. Yeah, it's normally leases. They just kind of go, oh yeah, we're not going to renew the lease. So yeah, they're very transient, and we think of them so central and solid. The New Globe, we were talking about New Globe actually earlier on in the evening. The New Globe has now lived longer than the original Globe.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, talking of lease and time running out, we're now just gone 8 o'clock. So we'll draw this official meeting to an end and repair to the vestry now for a glass of wine if you would like to join us. To remind you that in a month's time, this monthly talk, we have Philip Davis talking about London in the 1980s. So you're welcome to come to that. And then other talks later in the year. It just remains for me now to thank Heather once again for a most enlightening and interesting talk. And please join us at the back for a glass of wine. Thank you all very much for coming. Good.